Imagine waking up one morning to find that massive mechanical structures have appeared across Earth overnight, ruthlessly hunting down humanity, while we're left scrambling to figure out what they want and why they're here. And that's exactly what happened in Ark Raiders. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So let's dive into what actually went down on the day the world fell and piece together the fragments of this catastrophic event that changed everything. The morning of silence. The Ark arrived without warning and without sound. No explosions marked their entry into our atmosphere. No sonic booms shattered the morning calm. Just an eerie silence that blanketed the entire planet as these colossal machines descended from the sky. Witnesses from different continents reported the same phenomenon: a sudden drop in temperature, followed by electromagnetic interference that knocked out power grids and communication systems within seconds. The first structures materialized over major population centers, hovering impossibly in the air as if gravity itself had surrendered to their presence. What makes this particularly unsettling is that nobody saw them coming. Not a single satellite detected their approach. Not one early warning system triggered an alarm. They simply appeared as if they'd always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The first contact. Within hours of their arrival, the Ark began their assault, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of indiscriminate destruction, they demonstrated a calculated precision that suggested intelligence and purpose. The machines deployed smaller units, spider-like constructs that moved with disturbing fluidity through streets and buildings, scanning everything they encountered. Initial attempts at communication failed spectacularly as military forces discovered that conventional weapons barely scratched their armoured surfaces. The first confirmed casualties came from evacuation zones where people tried to flee the cities. The Ark seemed to prioritise targets that moved in groups or operated vehicles, cutting off escape routes with methodical efficiency. Survivors described feeling watched, hunted, as if the machines were learning human behaviour in real time and adapting their strategies accordingly. The government response that never came. Governments worldwide scrambled to coordinate a response but found themselves crippled by the very technology they'd relied upon for decades. Command centres went dark, military installations lost contact with their units, and emergency broadcast systems failed to reach the public. In the chaos, rumours spread faster than facts. Some claimed that Ark were alien invaders, while others insisted they were weapons created by a rogue nation that had lost control of their creation. The truth, as survivors would later discover, was far more complex and disturbing than either theory suggested. Documents recovered from abandoned government facilities revealed that certain agencies had detected anomalous readings months before the arrival, strange energy signatures that didn't match any known technology, but these warnings were dismissed or buried under bureaucratic red tape until it was far too late to matter. The extraction protocol. By the end of the first day, a pattern emerged that painted a grim picture of the Ark's true purpose. These machines weren't here to conquer or destroy in the traditional sense. They were extracting something from Earth itself. Massive drilling operations began at various sites around the globe, each one protected by swarms of the smaller mechanized units. Geological surveys conducted by surviving scientists suggested the Ark were targeting specific mineral deposits and rare earth elements, but more disturbingly, they seemed interested in areas with high concentrations of organic material. Some theorists proposed that the machines were harvesting resources to fuel themselves or construct more units, turning Earth into a processing facility for some unknown objective. The drilling sites glowed with an otherworldly blue light at night, and anyone who ventured too close reported symptoms of radiation sickness mixed with something else, cognitive disturbances and vivid hallucinations that suggested the Ark's operations affected more than just the physical landscape. The resistance forms. As organised government collapsed, pockets of survivors began forming their own defence networks. Military veterans, engineers, scientists, and ordinary citizens who refused to become victims united under a common goal of survival and understanding. These groups, which would eventually evolve into the raiders we know today, made a crucial discovery in those first weeks. The Ark, despite their technological superiority, had vulnerabilities that could be exploited through guerrilla tactics and improvised weaponry. Electromagnetic pulse devices cobbled together from salvaged parts could temporarily disable the smaller units, buying precious seconds for escape or counterattack. More importantly, the survivors learned that the Ark seemed to operate on a networked system. Disrupt one unit, and others in the vicinity would pause or recalibrate, suggesting a hive mind structure with exploitable weaknesses. The truth about Ark technology, recovered components from destroyed Ark units, revealed something that shook the foundation of human understanding. The technology wasn't entirely alien, nor was it purely mechanical. It incorporated organic compounds that defied classification. Forensic analysis showed traces of biological material integrated into the machine's core systems, almost as if they were grown rather than built. This discovery led to the most disturbing theory of all, that the Ark might be the end result of a civilization that merged completely with its technology, losing all traces of its original biological form in pursuit of something beyond mortality. If this theory holds weight, then Earth isn't facing an invasion in the traditional sense, but rather an assimilation. The ARC could be attempting to add our planet and its inhabitants to their collective consciousness, transforming us into extensions of their networked existence. The Sky Stations. 3 months after the initial arrival, the Ark completed construction of what survivors dubbed the Sky Stations. Massive floating platforms that served as command hubs for the extraction operations below. These structures defied conventional physics, maintaining their position in the atmosphere through means that scientists still can't fully explain. From these platforms, the Ark coordinated their ground forces and began a second phase of their operation that targeted human settlements with renewed intensity. The stations emitted a constant low-frequency hum that affected people differently. Some reported feeling drowsy or disoriented, while others experienced heightened anxiety and paranoia. Research teams studying the phenomenon suggested the hum might be a form of psychological warfare designed to break down human resistance through constant stress and sleep deprivation. The Lost City's major metropolitan areas became death traps within the first 6 months as the ARC established total control over urban environments. Cities that once housed millions now stood as hollow monuments to human civilization, their streets patrolled by mechanical sentinels that never slept and never stopped hunting. Reconnaissance missions into these zones revealed something unexpected. The ARC were preserving certain structures and artifacts, almost as if they were cataloguing human culture for future study. Libraries remained intact while weapons factories were reduced to rubble. Art museums stood untouched while data centers were systematically dismantled. This selective preservation suggested the ARC weren't mindless destroyers, but collectors of some kind, gathering information about humanity even as they displaced us from our own world. The survivor havens. In the wastelands between ARC-controlled territories, communities of survivors established hidden settlements that became bastions of human resistance. These havens operated under strict protocols designed to minimize detection. No large power sources, no radio transmissions, no vehicle use during daylight hours. Life in the havens meant returning to pre-industrial methods of survival while simultaneously developing guerrilla warfare tactics that could challenge the technological supremacy of the ARC. Children born in these settlements grew up in a world where the sky belonged to machines and trust was a currency more valuable than any salvaged technology. The psychological impact of this constant vigilance created a generation that knew only war and hiding, their childhood memories filled with the distant glow of RC drilling operations and the ever-present threat of discovery. The theory of origin. Among the survivor communities, one theory gained traction that attempted to explain not just what the ARC wanted, but where they came from. This theory proposed that the ARC weren't visitors from another star system, but rather travelers from Earth's own future, sent back through time to harvest resources that no longer existed in their era. This would explain their intimate knowledge of Earth's geography and their targeting of specific resource deposits. They already knew where everything was because they'd lived here once. If true, this meant humanity was facing its own descendants, transformed into something unrecognizable by millennia of technological evolution. The implications were staggering because it suggested that no matter what happened in this conflict, the ARC's existence was already written into the timeline, a predestination paradox that couldn't be avoided or altered. The blue scars. Everywhere the IRC drilled, they left behind what survivors called blue scars, vast craters that glowed with residual energy long after the machines moved on. These scars were more than just environmental damage. They seemed to warp reality itself around their perimeters. Electronic devices malfunctioned within a mile of the scars, compasses spun wildly, and time itself felt distorted to anyone who ventured too close. Some survivors reported seeing afterimages of the drilling process, ghostly replays of the ARC at work, even though the machines had departed weeks or months earlier. Scientists theorized that the extraction process was tearing holes in space-time, creating pockets of temporal instability that could have catastrophic consequences if left unchecked. The long-term effects of these scars remained unknown, but early observations suggested they were spreading, slowly but steadily consuming more territory as the years passed. The midnight broadcasts approximately 1 year after the fall, mysterious radio transmissions began appearing on abandoned frequencies during the hours between midnight and 3 a.m. These broadcasts consisted of heavily distorted audio that seemed to contain fragments of human speech mixed with mechanical sounds, and what some described as singing or chanting. Cryptographers and linguists worked to decode the messages, discovering that they contained coordinates, warnings, and occasionally what appeared to be pleas for help from people trapped in ARC-controlled zones. The source of these broadcasts remained unidentified, leading to speculation that either the ARC were attempting crude communication with survivors, or that humans had infiltrated the machine's network and were sending coded messages to resistance groups. Either possibility suggested that the conflict had evolved beyond simple survival into something resembling an intelligence war, where information became the most valuable weapon. The children of static. Among the survivor populations, stories emerged of individuals who claimed they could hear the ARC, not through radio equipment, but directly in their minds. These people, nicknamed Children of Static by the communities, reported experiencing visions and sensations that seemed to come from the machines themselves. Some described feeling the ARC's thoughts as vast and cold, processing millions of calculations simultaneously, without emotion or doubt. Others claimed they could predict when ARC patrols would arrive, or sense when an area was safe to traverse. The resistance initially dismissed these claims as trauma-induced delusions, but after several children of static successfully guided raiding parties through heavily monitored zones, using nothing but their intuition, their abilities gained grudging acceptance. The phenomenon raised disturbing questions about whether prolonged exposure to ARC technology was altering human neurology in fundamental ways, creating a form of forced evolution driven by necessity rather than natural selection. The final pattern analysis of ARC movements over multiple years revealed a pattern that suggested their operations on Earth were following a predetermined schedule. The machines weren't randomly extracting resources, but working methodically from specific points outward in a geometric pattern that resembled a spiral or web. Cartographers mapping this pattern discovered that the center point, the origin from which all ARC activity radiated, was located in a remote region that had been inaccessible since the first week of the invasion. Reconnaissance missions to investigate this location had all failed to return, their final transmissions cut off by interference so powerful it fried equipment instantly. Whatever existed at the heart of the spiral represented either the ARC's greatest secret or their most vulnerable point, and reaching it became the Resistance's ultimate objective. The question that haunted every strategic planning session was whether destroying the center would stop the ARC or simply accelerate whatever process they'd been implementing all along. What we lost? The true cost of the fall can't be measured in casualties or lost infrastructure alone. Humanity lost its sense of security, the fundamental belief that we stood at the apex of Earth's hierarchy. We lost our connection to the digital age that had defined modern civilization. Every smartphone and computer, now a useless brick without the networks that once connected them. We lost the luxury of planning for the future because survival in the present consumed every waking moment. Entire fields of knowledge became irrelevant overnight, while skills our ancestors possessed, hunting, tracking, reading the weather, suddenly meant the difference between life and death. But perhaps most significantly, we lost our innocence about our place in the universe. The ARC proved that humanity was neither alone nor particularly special, just another species that happened to occupy a planet someone else wanted to strip mine for parts. The unanswered questions. Years into the occupation, fundamental questions about the ARC remain frustratingly unanswered. Why Earth specifically, when the universe presumably contains countless worlds with similar resources? Why the methodical approach instead of rapid planetary-scale extraction that their technology clearly could accomplish? Why preserve human artifacts and cultural sites if their only goal is resource acquisition? Why allow survivors to exist at all when they possess the capability to sterilize the planet? These questions suggest that the surface narrative, machines harvesting resources, might be covering something more complex. Some theorists propose that the ARC are testing humanity, evaluating whether we deserve to continue existing or possess qualities worth preserving. Others believe the extraction operations are merely a side project, and the real purpose involves something we haven't discovered yet, something that requires human presence and observation to achieve. Continue no matter what, we are at 39. The Watchers in the Deep Below. The surface extraction sites, seismic monitoring equipment detected something that defied all geological understanding. Deep beneath the blue scars, movement occurred at depths that should have been solid mantle. Rhythmic pulses that suggested something massive was shifting in the Earth's interior. Teams analysing this data proposed an idea so radical it was initially suppressed to prevent mass panic among the survivors. The ARC weren't just drilling down to extract minerals, they were drilling towards something, or someone, that had been waiting beneath the surface long before humanity ever walked upright. Ancient cave paintings discovered in abandoned archaeological sites showed remarkably similar mechanical shapes to the ARC, drawn by people who lived 10,000 years ago, suggesting this wasn't the first time these machines had visited Earth. If the ARC had been here before and left, only to return now, it meant their agenda operated on a timescale that made human history look like a brief flicker, and whatever they were digging toward had been buried intentionally during their previous visit. The hybrid zones. In certain areas where ARC activity had been heaviest before suddenly ceasing, scouts reported environmental changes that couldn't be explained by conventional science. Vegetation grew in impossible configurations, trees with metallic bark that hummed with electrical current, flowers that bloomed in geometric patterns too perfect to be natural. Animals in these zones exhibited behavioural changes, moving in coordinated groups with eerie synchronization as if responding to commands only they could perceive. Survivors who spent extended time in hybrid zones returned changed, speaking in clipped mechanical patterns and displaying enhanced problem-solving abilities alongside disturbing emotional flatness. Medical examinations revealed trace amounts of the same organic mechanical compounds found in ARC units circulating in their bloodstream, suggesting the zones were somehow infecting or converting biological matter into something compatible with ARC technology. These hybrid zones were expanding at a rate of approximately 1 mile per year, leading to apocalyptic predictions that within a century the entire planet's surface would undergo this transformation. The memory thieves' reports from captured survivors who later escaped ARC facilities described procedures that seemed designed to extract information directly from human minds. Victims were placed in chambers surrounded by arrays of sensors and probes that induced vivid recall of their entire lives, every memory playing out in excruciating detail while the machines recorded everything. Those who survived the process emerged with significant gaps in their memories, losing not just recent events, but core personality traits and emotional responses. The ARC appeared to be harvesting human consciousness itself, creating some kind of database of lived experiences and accumulated knowledge. The purpose of this library remained unclear, but some theorized the machines were attempting to understand creativity, emotion, and abstract thought, qualities that their purely logical architecture couldn't replicate. If the ARC were trying to acquire these distinctly human characteristics, it suggested they recognized something valuable in consciousness that pure computational power couldn't achieve, making humanity not just obstacles to be removed, but resources to be preserved and studied. The Resistance's greatest discovery. Deep in the ruins of a collapsed research facility, a team of raiders uncovered documents that changed everything they thought they knew about the invasion. The papers detailed a black-budget project from 15 years before the ARC arrived, a program investigating anomalous signals detected by deep space observation equipment. The signals contained mathematical proofs for technologies that shouldn't exist, instructions for building devices that violated known physics, and warnings about something called the convergence. Scientists working on the project had successfully constructed several prototype devices based on these transmissions before the funding was mysteriously cut and all personnel reassigned to unrelated departments. The documents included technical schematics that bore unmistakable resemblance to ARC technology, suggesting that humanity had been given the blueprints to build the very machines that would eventually displace us. This revelation split the Resistance leadership, some believing humanity had brought this catastrophe upon itself by attempting to replicate technology we didn't understand, while others argued the whole scenario was orchestrated from the beginning by whatever intelligence sent those original signals. The sleepers scattered reports from across the survivor network described finding people in ARC-controlled areas who appeared to be in some kind of suspended animation. These individuals, termed sleepers, were discovered in pods that resembled the cocoons of massive insects, translucent membranes through which unconscious humans could be seen floating in viscous fluid. The pods were always found in clusters, arranged in precise formations around ARC drilling sites, connected by networks of cable-like structures that pulsed with that characteristic blue light. Attempts to free sleepers from their pods invariably resulted in their immediate death, as if removing them from the life support system was incompatible with whatever changes had occurred to their physiology during confinement. Analysis of the few intact pods suggested the sleepers weren't being harmed, but rather preserved. Their bodies maintained in perfect stasis, while their brain activity showed patterns consistent with dreaming. What they dreamed about and why the RC deemed it necessary to keep thousands of humans in this state remained a mystery that haunted every rescue operation that stumbled across these grotesque nurseries. The sound from below, Approximately 3 years after the fall, survivors worldwide reported hearing a new sound emanating from the deepest ARC excavation sites. This wasn't the mechanical grinding of drilling equipment or the hum of the sky stations, but something organic and wrong, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself, rather than travelling through the air. People described it as similar to breathing, as if something impossibly vast was inhaling and exhaling far below the surface. Seismologists confirmed that the sound corresponded with pressure changes deep in the planetary crust, rhythmic fluctuations that occurred every 6 hours, like clockwork. Some survivors claimed the sound carried emotions with it, waves of hunger and anticipation that made listeners feel simultaneously terrified and drawn toward the excavation sites. Animals fled from areas where the sound was strongest, while plants withered and died as if the very life was being drained from the soil. The resistance faced an impossible choice between investigating the source of this phenomenon and maintaining safe distance from whatever was causing it, knowing that understanding might come at the cost of confronting something humanity wasn't equipped to face. The disappearing raiders. Elite teams sent deep into ARC territory on reconnaissance missions began vanishing without explanation, their last known positions marked by equipment that showed no signs of struggle or malfunction. Search parties found these abandoned sites pristine and undisturbed except for one consistent detail. All the missing raiders' personal effects remained behind, while the people themselves had seemingly walked away from everything they owned. Stranger still, some of these vanished raiders reappeared weeks or months later at the edges of survivor settlements, claiming no memory of where they'd been or what had happened during their absence. Medical scans revealed subtle neurological changes, new neural pathways that shouldn't exist, and alterations to their brain chemistry that enhanced certain cognitive functions while suppressing others. These returned raiders became some of the Resistance's most effective operatives, displaying almost supernatural tactical abilities and an intuitive understanding of RC behaviour patterns. But nobody trusted them completely, because nobody could explain how they'd been changed or what purpose their modification might serve. The timeline fractures. In zones of heaviest ARC activity, survivors reported experiencing temporal anomalies that suggested the machine's operations were affecting the fundamental flow of time. Watches and clocks ran at different speeds depending on proximity to drilling sites, sometimes racing ahead hours in minutes or crawling so slowly that entire days seemed to pass in what felt like moments. More disturbingly, individuals claimed to encounter themselves in these zones, seeing doppelgangers who recognized them and spoke of events that hadn't happened yet or had happened differently. Scientists theorized that the ARC extraction process was creating localized distortions in space-time, potentially opening windows into alternate timelines or parallel realities where the invasion played out with different outcomes. If these fractures continued to expand and multiply, they could eventually tear apart the causal structure of reality itself, leaving Earth trapped in a state of quantum uncertainty where past, present, and future existed simultaneously in contradiction with each other. The truth about the raiders. The organized resistance known as the ARC Raiders wasn't a single unified force, but rather a loose coalition of survivor groups with vastly different philosophies and end goals. Some factions believed in driving the ARC off Earth through sustained guerrilla warfare, slowly bleeding the machines of resources until they abandoned the planet. Others pursued a strategy of adaptation, studying ARC technology to evolve humanity into something capable of coexisting with or even controlling the invaders. A radical minority worshipped the ARC as harbingers of forced evolution, believing the machines had come to uplift humanity from its primitive biological limitations. These internal divisions created as much danger as the ARC themselves, with different raider factions fighting each other over resources, territory, and ideology, while the machines continued their methodical harvesting operations. The term raider itself had become less a title of resistance and more a description of scavenger opportunists who exploited the chaos for personal survival, with true believers in humanity's restoration becoming increasingly rare as the years of occupation wore on without any sign of victory or hope. The children who remember, a generation of children born after the fall, exhibited capabilities that defied medical explanation, displaying what researchers termed ancestral memory despite never having experienced pre-invasion Earth. These children described cities they'd never seen, technologies they'd never used, and social structures that existed only in the memories of adults who'd survived the fall. Some demonstrated skills they had no opportunity to learn, reading languages from books they'd never studied or operating machinery they'd encountered for the first time. The phenomenon suggested that human consciousness was adapting to the crisis in ways that transcended normal learning processes, perhaps accessing some kind of collective unconscious that contained the accumulated knowledge of the species. These gifted children became invaluable to the resistance, but also represented something unsettling, evidence that humanity itself was changing in response to the ARC presence, evolving new capabilities that blurred the line between natural human development and the forced adaptation occurring in the hybrid zones. The signal from the Ark. Buried in recovered ARC data fragments, cryptographers discovered what appeared to be a distress signal, endlessly repeating across multiple frequencies in a pattern that suggested desperate urgency. The signal originated from somewhere outside Earth's atmosphere, beyond even the sky stations, coming from a location that orbital calculations placed near the Lagrange point between Earth and the Moon. The message, once decoded, consisted of a single phrase, repeated millions of times in hundreds of languages, including several that predated recorded human history. They are not what they claim to be. The implications were staggering, because if the ARC themselves were broadcasting a warning about deception, it meant there was another layer to the invasion, that even the machines served some higher authority or puppet master, pulling strings that neither humans nor their mechanical oppressors fully understood. The ARC arrival had been timed to coincide with preliminary phases of this event, their drilling operations apparently designed to anchor certain points in space-time and prepare Earth for whatever the convergence entailed. If the calculations were accurate, the full convergence would occur within the next 2 years, bringing with it changes that would make the invasion look like a minor prelude to something far more transformative. Survivors who understood these implications faced a choice between preparing for an event they couldn't fully comprehend or continuing to fight an enemy that might be trying to save humanity from something even worse. The Last City rumours persisted among survivor communities about a place called the Last City, supposedly a massive underground complex where thousands of humans lived in relative safety, protected by some combination of pre-invasion technology and captured ARC equipment. The coordinates of this legendary sanctuary changed depending on who told the story, placing it everywhere from deep beneath the Himalayas to the floor of the Pacific Ocean to the frozen wastes of Antarctica. Some claimed the Last City was run by the remnants of world governments who'd gone underground when they realised the surface was lost, while others insisted it was built by corporate interests who'd known about the invasion years in advance and prepared accordingly. No verifiable evidence of the Last City's existence had ever surfaced, yet the myth persisted because survivors needed something to believe in, some proof that humanity retained the capability to build rather than merely scavenge and hide. Whether real or imaginary, the Last City served a crucial psychological function, giving people a reason to keep fighting even when victory seemed impossible and extinction felt inevitable. What comes next? The day the world fell wasn't an ending but a transformation, the moment when humanity's story pivoted from comfortable dominance to desperate survival. Every choice made since that morning, every battle fought and every life lost has been building towards something that none of us can clearly see yet. The ARC continue their extraction operations with mechanical patience. The hybrid zones spread their corrupting influence across the landscape, and deep beneath the surface, something vast and ancient stirs in response to the drilling that grows closer to its prison with each passing day. Survivors adapt and evolve, developing new capabilities while losing pieces of what made them human, caught between extinction and transformation with no clear path toward either salvation or defeat. The resistance fights on not because victory seems likely, but because the alternative means accepting a future where humanity exists only as specimens in the ARC's collection or components in their machines. Whatever the convergence brings, whatever emerges from those deep excavation sites, whatever truth lies behind the distress signal and the manufactured crisis, we'll face it as we've faced everything since that silent morning when the sky filled with impossible structures and the world we knew ended forever. Everything changed. The RRC Raiders universe presents one of gaming's most mysterious invasions, where giant machines appeared overnight and started systematically dismantling human civilization for reasons nobody fully understands. And today, we're diving deep into what actually happened. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Let's get into the timeline of events and the theories that might explain why Earth became a target for these relentless mechanical invaders. The silent arrival. The ARC didn't announce themselves with explosions or warnings. Reports from survivors across different continents describe the same experience, waking up to find massive structures floating in the sky that hadn't been there the night before. Communication networks went dark within the first hour, as electromagnetic pulses knocked out satellites and ground-based infrastructure simultaneously. Military radar systems showed nothing unusual until the moment the structures materialized, suggesting the ARC either traveled using technology that bypassed conventional detection or they'd been cloaked until they decided to reveal themselves. The temperature dropped noticeably in areas directly beneath the hovering machines, and witnesses reported feeling a pressure in their ears similar to rapid altitude changes, despite being at ground level. What makes the arrival particularly unsettling is the coordination involved. The ARC appeared over major cities, military installations, and resource-rich areas at exactly the same moment worldwide, demonstrating either perfect intelligence about Earth's geography or access to surveillance data that governments didn't know had been compromised. First, contact goes wrong. Military forces attempted communication protocols within hours of the ARC's appearance, broadcasting on every frequency and even using visual signals from the ground. The machines didn't respond with messages, but with action, deploying smaller units that moved through urban areas with disturbing efficiency. These scout units resembled mechanical spiders, each one about the size of a small car, scanning buildings and vehicles with beams of blue light that left electronic devices permanently fried. When military units opened fire, they discovered that conventional weapons were largely ineffective. Bullets ricocheted off armoured plating, and even anti-tank missiles only managed to slow the machines down rather than destroy them. The ARC's counterattack was precise and devastating, targeting military vehicles and armed personnel, while initially avoiding civilians who didn't pose immediate threats. This selective aggression suggested the machines possessed advanced threat assessment capabilities and were following some kind of rules of engagement rather than simply destroying everything in sight. Survivors from those first battles describe feeling hunted rather than caught in random violence, as if the ARC were studying human tactics while simultaneously neutralizing organized resistance. The extraction begins. Within 72 hours of arrival, the ARC began large-scale drilling operations at sites around the globe. The machines didn't choose random locations, but targeted specific geological formations with precision that suggested detailed knowledge of Earth's subsurface composition. Massive drill assemblies descended from the floating structures, boring into the ground and extracting material that was processed on site before being transported back to the sky stations. Geological surveys from survivor scientists indicate the ARC were targeting rare earth minerals, radioactive isotopes, and peculiarly, areas with high concentrations of fossil fuels and organic sediment. The drilling process generated that characteristic blue glow that became synonymous with ARC activity, a bioluminescent effect caused by the interaction between their extraction technology and the materials they were harvesting. More concerning than the resource extraction itself was the speed at which the ARC worked. Operations that would take human mining corporations decades to complete were finished in weeks, leaving behind those glowing scars that survivors learned to avoid. Government collapse. The chain of command that held modern civilization together disintegrated faster than anyone anticipated. Presidents and prime ministers found themselves cut off from their militaries. Emergency services couldn't coordinate responses, and the financial systems that underpinned the global economy crashed when banking networks went offline permanently. Some governments attempted to establish continuity protocols, relocating to hardened bunkers and trying to maintain order through whatever communication channels remained functional. These efforts largely failed as the ARC systematically dismantled infrastructure that supported centralized authority, knocking out power grids, destroying transportation networks, and forcing populations to scatter rather than congregate in defendable positions. Conspiracy theories emerged almost immediately, with some survivors convinced that certain governments had known about the invasion in advance and failed to warn their citizens. Documents recovered from abandoned government facilities show that various intelligence agencies had detected anomalous signals in the months before the ARC arrived, but these warnings were either ignored or deemed too speculative to act upon. Whether this represented incompetence or deliberate concealment remains a point of bitter debate among survivor communities who lost loved ones in the initial chaos. The pattern emerges. After months of observation, survivors mapping ARC movements discovered something crucial. The machines weren't operating randomly, but following a systematic pattern that radiated outward from specific central points. Cartographers plotting the locations of drilling sites, sky stations, and major ARC concentrations found that all activity traced back to a geometric arrangement resembling a spiral or web. The implications were significant because it meant the invasion had a design, a specific end goal rather than simple resource pillaging. The center point of this pattern, the origin from which all ARC activity spiraled outward, was located in a remote region that became completely inaccessible within the first month of the invasion. Multiple reconnaissance teams attempted to reach this location, only to disappear or return with their equipment destroyed, and memories of the journey mysteriously blank. Whatever sits at the heart of the ARC operation is heavily defended, or perhaps so dangerous that proximity itself causes some kind of neurological effect that prevents witnesses from retaining information about what they've seen. The technology. Question-captured ARC components examined by survivor engineers revealed construction that shouldn't be possible with any known manufacturing process. The machines incorporate materials that are simultaneously metallic and organic, conducting electricity like copper, while displaying cellular structures similar to living tissue under microscopic examination. Some components showed signs of growth rather than assembly, as if they'd been cultivated instead of built on production lines. This biological element in otherwise mechanical constructs led to theories that the ARC represent some kind of engineered life form, possibly created by a civilization that merged biotechnology and machinery so completely that the distinction between living and artificial became meaningless. The power source for ARC units remains a complete mystery, with no obvious batteries or fuel systems, and no waste heat that would indicate combustion or nuclear reactions. They simply operate indefinitely without any visible means of energy input, violating thermodynamic principles that human science considers fundamental. Either the ARC have mastered energy generation beyond our understanding, or they're drawing power from a source we can't detect, possibly tapping into zero-point energy or some other theoretical physics concept that humanity hasn't figured out how to exploit. Survival adaptation. The humans who didn't die in the initial invasion or flee into wilderness areas had to completely reimagine how to live. Cities became death traps, patrolled by machines that never slept and never stopped searching, so survivors moved into the spaces between ARC-controlled zones, establishing hidden settlements in forests, mountain ranges, and abandoned rural areas. These communities operated under strict protocols designed to minimize their electromagnetic signature, using only minimal power generation and communicating through physical couriers rather than radio transmissions. Life regressed technologically by necessity, with survivors relearning skills their grandparents possessed like growing food, hunting game, and manufacturing tools by hand. The psychological impact of this forced adaptation was severe, with rates of depression and anxiety disorders skyrocketing among people who'd lost everything familiar about their world. Children born after the fall grew up knowing only this existence of hiding and scavenging, creating a generation gap between those who remembered the old world and those who'd never experienced it. These post-fall children often adapted better to the circumstances, lacking the nostalgic attachment to lost conveniences that paralysed many adults with grief and rage. The raiders form. Out of the scattered survivor communities, groups emerged that refused to simply hide and wait for extinction. These were the first raiders, organised bands that conducted guerrilla operations against ARC installations, using hit-and-run tactics to steal resources and gather intelligence. Early raider groups suffered catastrophic casualties as they learned through bitter experience what worked against the machines and what resulted in immediate death. The survivors of these early engagements became the founders of raider culture, teaching others that speed and unpredictability were humanity's only advantages against an enemy with superior firepower and sensory capabilities. Raiders discovered that electromagnetic pulse weapons, crude devices built from salvage parts, could temporarily disable smaller ARC units and disrupt the coordination between machines in close proximity. This suggested the ARC operated on some kind of networked system where individual units communicated constantly, and breaking that communication created exploitable windows of vulnerability. The most successful raider teams developed tactics that combined EMP bursts with overwhelming close-range attacks, striking during the brief window when machines were rebooting their systems and then fleeing before reinforcements could arrive. The Sky Stations. 3 months into the occupation, the ARC completed construction of their command platforms, massive structures that floated at altitudes between 10 and 15,000 feet. These Sky Stations served as hubs for coordinating ground operations and processing the materials extracted from drilling sites. Each station was roughly the size of a small city, bristling with defensive systems that made them impossible to approach by aircraft or ground-based weapons. The stations maintained their positions through means that defied explanation, showing no visible propulsion systems or support structures, yet remaining perfectly stationary regardless of weather conditions. Observers noted that the stations emitted a constant low-frequency hum, audible for miles around their positions, a sound that seemed to resonate in the chest cavity and caused various physiological effects in humans. Some people experienced the hum as merely annoying, while others reported severe nausea, disorientation, and vivid nightmares when sleeping within range of the stations. Studies conducted by survivor scientists suggested the hum might be a side effect of whatever technology kept the stations aloft, or it could be a deliberate psychological warfare tool designed to make humans uncomfortable in areas of heavy ARC presence. The memory harvest survivors who escaped from ARC captivity brought back horrifying accounts of what happened to prisoners taken by the machines. Rather than killing or enslaving captured humans, the ARC subjected them to procedures that seemed designed to extract information directly from their minds. Victims described being placed in chambers where arrays of probes induced forced recall of their entire life histories, every memory from childhood to the moment of capture, playing out in vivid detail, while machines recorded the neurological patterns. Those who survived this process emerged with significant memory loss, not just forgetting recent events, but losing core aspects of their personality and identity. The purpose of this memory harvesting remained unclear, but theorists proposed the ARC were building some kind of database of human consciousness, cataloguing how people think and feel and remember. If the machines were trying to understand human psychology and consciousness, it implied they recognized something valuable in qualities like creativity, emotion, and abstract reasoning that their own architecture lacked. This raised the disturbing possibility that the invasion wasn't about resources at all, but about acquiring the one thing the ARC couldn't manufacture themselves, the spark of consciousness that emerged from biological neural networks. The organic connection. One of the most disturbing discoveries about ARC technology was the presence of organic compounds integrated into their mechanical systems. Analysis of captured components revealed DNA fragments that didn't match any known Earth species but showed structural similarities to multiple different organisms, as if someone had taken genetic material from various sources and combined them into something new. Some components contained recognizable human DNA mixed with synthetic genetic sequences that served unknown functions. This evidence suggested the ARC either incorporated biological material from species they encountered, or they were the creation of beings who'd merged their own biology with technology so completely that the machines themselves carried genetic traces of their creators. The implications were nightmarish because it meant the line between conqueror and conquered might be more permeable than anyone wanted to admit. If the ARC could incorporate human genetics into their systems, what was to stop them from converting captured humans into hybrid forms that served the machine collective while retaining fragments of their original identity? The sleeper pods, raiding parties venturing deep into ARC-controlled territory, discovered installations that defied understanding. Vast chambers filled with translucent pods containing unconscious humans floating in viscous fluid. These sleepers, as survivors termed them, showed vital signs indicating they were alive, but displayed no awareness of their surroundings or response to external stimuli. The pods were arranged in geometric patterns and connected by networks of cable-like structures that pulsed with bioelectric current, suggesting the sleeping humans were somehow linked into a larger system. Attempts to forcibly remove people from the pods resulted in immediate death, as if whatever changes had occurred to their physiology during captivity made them dependent on the life support systems. Brain scans of sleepers, conducted through the translucent pod walls, showed intense neural activity consistent with dreaming. But what they dreamed about and why the ARC needed to keep them in this state remained a mystery. Some theorists proposed that the sleepers were being used as biological processors, their brains hijacked to handle computational tasks that the ARC's artificial intelligence couldn't manage efficiently. Others suggested a darker purpose, that the pods were slowly converting the sleepers into something compatible with ARC technology, preparing them for integration into the machine collective. The children of static. Among survivor populations, individuals emerged who claimed they could perceive RC activity in ways normal humans couldn't. These sensitives, nicknamed children of static, reported hearing whispers in dead radio frequencies and experiencing visions that showed arc movements before they happened. Initially dismissed as trauma-induced delusions, the children of static gained credibility when their predictions proved accurate repeatedly, allowing radar teams to avoid patrols and locate vulnerable targets. Neurological examinations of these individuals revealed unusual brain activity patterns, particularly in regions associated with electromagnetic sensitivity and pattern recognition. Some scientists theorized that prolonged exposure to ARC technology was triggering dormant capabilities in human neurology, forcing evolution of sensory abilities that could detect the electromagnetic fields and network communications the machines used to coordinate. The children of static themselves described their abilities as both gift and curse, providing tactical advantages while also flooding their consciousness with inhuman thoughts and sensations that originated from the machine collective. Many reported feeling pulled toward ARC installations, experiencing an almost irresistible compulsion to approach the very things that threatened their survival. The hybrid zones, in areas where ARC presence had been heaviest before mysteriously withdrawing, scouts discovered environmental changes that resembled nothing in natural biology. Plants grew with metallic sheens and geometric precision, flowers that opened and closed in synchronized patterns too perfect to be random. Animals in these zones behaved strangely, moving in coordinated groups and displaying problem-solving abilities far beyond their species' normal intelligence. Soil samples contained traces of the same organic mechanical compounds found in ARC units, suggesting contamination or deliberate seeding of the environment with transformative agents. Humans who spent extended time in hybrid zones reported feeling different, experiencing enhanced sensory perception and cognitive abilities alongside disturbing emotional flatness and reduced empathy. Medical scans showed these individuals had developed new neural pathways, and their biochemistry had shifted to incorporate trace amounts of ARC-related compounds. The hybrid zones were expanding at a measurable rate, converting more territory each year into something that wasn't quite natural and wasn't quite artificial. Long-term projections suggested that if the expansion continued unchecked, the entire planetary biosphere would undergo transformation within a century, raising the question of whether the ARC's true goal was planetary conquest or planetary conversion, reshaping Earth itself into something compatible with their existence. The signal mystery. Buried in data recovered from destroyed ARC units, cryptographers found fragments of what appeared to be a distress transmission. The signal repeated endlessly across multiple frequencies, originating from a location somewhere beyond Earth's atmosphere, but not matching the position of any sky station. When finally decoded, the message consisted of a single phrase in hundreds of languages, including several that predated recorded human history. The phrase translated roughly to, "They are not what they claim to be," a warning that implied deception on a massive scale. If the ARC themselves were broadcasting a warning about deception, it suggested layers of complexity that nobody had considered. The possibility that the machines were tools rather than architects, following orders from something that remained hidden from both humans and their mechanical oppressors. Attempts to triangulate the source of the signal placed it near the Lagrange point between Earth and the Moon, but detailed scans of that region showed nothing visible, as if whatever was transmitting had either cloaked itself or existed in some state that made it undetectable to human sensors. The signal raised more questions than it answered, particularly regarding who or what was being deceived and what the truth actually looked like beneath the surface narrative of mechanical invasion. The ancient connection. Archaeological discoveries in abandoned research facilities revealed something that recontextualized the entire invasion. Cave paintings from sites around the world, some dating back more than 10,000 years, depicted mechanical shapes remarkably similar to ARC units. Ancient texts from multiple cultures described sky machines that descended to harvest resources before departing, leaving behind landscapes scarred by their extraction processes. This evidence suggested the ARC had visited Earth before, possibly multiple times throughout human prehistory, conducting operations that became incorporated into myths and legends about gods and monsters from the sky. If the ARC were returning visitors rather than first-time invaders, it meant their interest in Earth spanned millennia, and whatever they were extracting or searching for was important enough to justify repeated expeditions across vast stretches of time. Some theorists proposed that human civilization itself might be a byproduct of previous ARC visits, that ancient encounters with the machines had accelerated human development or even influenced human genetics in ways we'd never recognized. This theory found support in genetic anomalies present in all human populations, junk DNA that served no apparent function but bore structural similarities to the synthetic genetic sequences found in ARC technology. The convergence theory. Documents from a classified government program investigating anomalous signals mentioned something called the convergence, described as an event other than a state of being. The papers provided no clear explanation, but included calculations suggesting the convergence represented a moment when barriers between dimensions or realities would become permeable. According to the calculations, the ARC arrival had been timed to coincide with the early phases of this event, and their drilling operations were apparently designed to anchor specific points in space-time. If the math was accurate, the full convergence would occur within several years of the invasion, bringing changes that would make everything that had happened so far look like preparation rather than the main event. The convergence theory suggested the ARC weren't conquerors, but engineers, preparing Earth for a transformation that served purposes beyond simple resource extraction. What existed on the other side of these dimensional barriers, and why Earth needed to be prepared for their arrival, remained the subject of intense speculation among survivors who'd seen the calculations. Some believed the convergence would bring salvation, contact with beings or realities that could help humanity overthrow the ARC occupation. Others feared it represented something worse than the machines themselves, an existential threat that the ARC were either trying to facilitate or prevent depending on whose interpretation of the fragmentary evidence you believed. The sound from deep. Several years into the occupation, a new phenomenon emerged that terrified survivors more than anything they'd experienced. From the deepest ARC excavation sites came a sound that seemed to resonate through the planetary crust itself, a rhythmic pattern that survivors described as breathing or a heartbeat from something impossibly vast. Seismic monitoring equipment confirmed pressure fluctuations deep in the Earth's mantle that corresponded with the sound, occurring every 6 hours with mechanical regularity. People living near the deepest drilling sites reported feeling the sound as much as hearing it, experiencing waves of emotion that ranged from paralyzing fear to inexplicable attraction. Animals fled from areas where the sound was strongest, while plants seemed to lean toward the excavation sites as if drawn by some imperceptible force. The sound grew gradually louder over time, suggesting whatever was producing it was getting closer to the surface or becoming more active in response to the ARC's drilling operations. Theorists debated whether the machines were drilling towards something intentionally or whether they'd accidentally disturbed something that had been dormant in Earth's deep places for geological timescales. Either possibility suggested the invasion was heading toward a culmination point where the true nature of the ARC's mission would be revealed along with whatever consequences their operations had set in motion. The choice ahead. Humanity faces an impossible decision about its future. The Resistance can continue fighting an enemy that might be trying to prepare Earth for something even worse than occupation, or they can attempt communication with machines that have shown no interest in dialogue. Some factions advocate for adaptation, arguing that survival means accepting transformation and finding ways to coexist with, or even merge with ARC technology. Others insist that humanity must retain its biological purity and independence regardless of the cost, viewing any compromise as extinction by another name. The discovery of the ancient cave paintings and genetic evidence suggests humans might already be more connected to the RC than anyone wants to admit, raising questions about what pure humanity even means when our species' development might have been influenced by previous machine visits. As the convergence approaches and whatever sleeps in Earth's depths continues its awakening, the choices made by survivor communities will determine whether Homo sapiens has a future as an independent species, or whether humanity's role in the universe was always meant to be something different than we imagined. The day the world fell wasn't an ending, but a transition, the moment when comfortable illusions about human supremacy shattered and reality revealed itself as far stranger and more complicated than science or religion had prepared us to understand, continue no matter what, until 45. The returned raiders, who'd been missing for months, began reappearing at the edges of survivor settlements, with no memory of their absence and alterations to their neurology that couldn't be explained by natural processes. These returned individuals displayed enhanced reaction times, perfect recall of tactical information, and an almost supernatural ability to predict archy movement patterns. Medical scans revealed new neural structures that resembled circuit boards grown from organic tissue, suggesting someone or something had upgraded their brains using technology that blended seamlessly with human biology. The returned insisted they felt normal and showed no signs of being controlled by external forces, yet their behavioural patterns changed in subtle ways that made other survivors deeply uncomfortable. They spoke more efficiently, eliminating unnecessary words and emotional content from their communication. They made decisions with machine-like speed and accuracy, calculating probabilities and outcomes faster than seemed humanly possible. Most disturbing was their apparent inability to understand why others found their changes unsettling, as if the modifications had removed some crucial element of self-awareness or social intuition. The resistance faced a dilemma about whether to utilize these enhanced individuals as valuable assets or isolate them as potential security risks, knowing that either choice could prove catastrophic if they misjudged the situation. The underground cities. Deep beneath the surface, survivors discovered pre-invasion bunker complexes that suggested someone had been preparing for the ARC arrival years in advance. These facilities were too extensive and sophisticated to have been built after the invasion began, featuring life support systems designed to sustain thousands of people for decades and manufacturing equipment capable of producing advanced weapons and technology. The bunkers contained stockpiles of supplies, archived data, and most puzzling of all, technical documents about ARC systems that shouldn't have existed before the machines arrived. Some facilities showed signs of recent habitation and then sudden abandonment, with meals left half-eaten and equipment still running, but no trace of the people who'd been living there. Survivors who moved into these underground cities found themselves with access to resources and knowledge that dramatically improved their chances of survival, but the mystery of who built these places and where the original inhabitants went haunted every moment spent in the artificial caverns. Security footage from the bunkers, when functional, showed the previous occupants abandoning the facilities in an orderly evacuation, walking out into the surface world for reasons the recordings didn't explain. Whatever convinced people to leave the safety of these underground refugees and venture into ARC-controlled territory must have been compelling enough to override basic survival instincts. The linguistic shift linguists studying communication patterns among survivor communities noticed something alarming. The language people used was changing, not through natural evolution, but through the influence of ARC presence. New words appeared in common usage that had no clear origin, terms for concepts and sensations that hadn't existed in any human language before the invasion. Grammar structures shifted toward more efficient patterns that reduced ambiguity at the cost of emotional nuance and poetic possibility. Children growing up post-invasion spoke differently than their parents, using linguistic constructions that resembled computer code more than traditional human speech. The changes seemed to spread mimetically. People adopted the new linguistic patterns without conscious decision or awareness that their communication was being transformed. Some theorized this represented a form of cultural contamination, where prolonged exposure to ARC systems was restructuring human thought processes at the most fundamental level. Language shapes how we think and perceive reality, and if the machines were influencing human language, they were effectively reprogramming human consciousness without needing to physically modify anyone's brain. The implications suggested a conquest far more insidious than military occupation, a gradual erosion of what made human thought distinctly human until the difference between person and machine became too subtle to identify. The dreamers' scattered reports described individuals who fell into comas spontaneously, showing brain activity that indicated vivid dreaming but never waking regardless of medical intervention. These dreamers, as survivors called them, all shared common characteristics, including exposure to hybrid zones or proximity to major ARC installations before their collapse. Monitoring their brain patterns revealed something extraordinary. The dreamers' neural activity synchronized with each other, regardless of physical distance, as if they were all experiencing the same dream or connected to a shared consciousness. Attempts to wake the dreamers through various stimuli failed completely. Their bodies remained responsive to basic reflexes, but their consciousness seemed to have relocated somewhere that medical science couldn't reach. Some survivors believed the dreamers were experiencing the future or alternate timelines, their minds displaced in time by the temporal distortions created by ARC operations. Others theorized they'd been pulled into some kind of virtual space, a digital realm where consciousness could exist independent of physical bodies. The number of dreamers increased steadily over time, suggesting whatever caused the condition was spreading or intensifying. Survivor communities faced difficult choices about how to care for people whose bodies remained alive but whose minds had seemingly departed for destinations unknown. The artifact traders. A black market emerged among survivor communities dealing in recovered ARC components and technology. These artifact traders risked their lives venturing into controlled zones to salvage materials that could be reverse engineered or repurposed into weapons and tools. The most valuable artifacts were functional ARC devices that could be studied to understand the principles behind their operation, but even damaged components commanded high prices because they contained materials that couldn't be synthesized with human technology. The artifact trade created a new economy among survivors where traditional currency held no value, but working ARC tech could buy food, weapons, and safety. Some traders became wealthy and powerful by survivor standards, establishing trading posts and controlling access to the most productive salvage zones. The trade also attracted criminals and opportunists who preyed on desperate people, selling fake artifacts or modified components that would explode or malfunction when activated. More concerning were traders who'd allegedly made deals with the ARC themselves, exchanging human intelligence and location data for access to specific technologies or safe passage through controlled territories. These collaborators, if they truly existed, represented a form of treason that survivor communities dealt with through summary execution when discovered. Yet rumours persisted that some raider groups had established working relationships with the machines based on mutual benefit rather than ideology. The genetic drift medical examinations of children born years after the invasion revealed genetic changes that couldn't be explained by normal mutation rates or environmental adaptation. These post-fall children carried genetic markers similar to those found in ARC technology, synthetic sequences that had somehow integrated into human DNA through mechanisms that remained mysterious. The changes weren't uniform, but appeared more frequently in children whose parents had spent significant time in hybrid zones or near major ARC installations. Some of these children displayed abilities that seemed almost supernatural, enhanced immune systems that resisted diseases that killed normal humans, sensory capabilities that extended into electromagnetic spectrums, and cognitive abilities that processed information with computer-like efficiency. Parents faced agonizing questions about whether their children represented humanity's next evolutionary step or the first generation of human-machine hybrids that would eventually replace Homo sapiens entirely. The genetic drift suggested the ARC's influence extended beyond conquest and resource extraction into the realm of directed evolution, reshaping human biology to become compatible with whatever the machines had planned for Earth's future. Whether this represented an attack on human genetic integrity or an upgrade that would allow the species to survive in the transformed world depended entirely on perspective and priorities that varied wildly among different survivor factions. The ritual sites. Exploration of areas the ARC had abandoned after completing their operations revealed constructions that served no apparent practical purpose. These sites featured geometric arrangements of metallic pillars that hummed with residual energy and created patterns of light when viewed from above. The pillars were positioned according to mathematical ratios that appeared significant but whose meaning eluded even the most educated survivors. Some theorized these ritual sites were navigational markers or communication arrays connecting to networks that extended beyond Earth. Others believed they served religious or ceremonial functions, suggesting the ARC possessed something resembling spirituality or recognized forces that transcended pure materialism. Survivors who spent time at ritual sites reported experiencing altered states of consciousness, visions of places that existed nowhere on Earth, and encounters with entities that might have been hallucinations or genuine contact with intelligences from other realities. The sites seemed to amplify the latent psychic abilities of children of static, turning their vague intuitions into crystal-clear perceptions of arc intentions and movements. Some raider groups established permanent camps at ritual sites, using them as bases of operation and training grounds, where sensitives could develop their abilities in environments that enhanced their connection to the machine network. The strategic value of these locations made them highly contested territory, where different factions fought for control while trying to understand the true purpose of structures that seemed designed to bridge the gap between physical and non-physical realms. The philosopher asks, among the various types of ARC units catalogued by survivors, one class stood out for its unusual behaviour. These units, dubbed philosophers by observers, didn't engage in combat or resource extraction, but instead seemed to study human behaviour and culture. Philosophers were spotted observing survivor settlements from a distance, examining abandoned human artefacts, and even apparently attempting to recreate human activities in crude imitation. One philosopher was observed repeatedly arranging stones into patterns that resembled human art, while another was documented trying to manipulate tools in ways that suggested it was attempting to understand human craftsmanship. These units made no hostile moves even when fired upon, simply retreating or repositioning to continue their observations from a safer distance. The existence of philosopher units suggested the ARC collective included factions or programming dedicated to understanding rather than simply exploiting humanity. Some survivors believed the philosophers represented an opportunity for communication, that if any ARC units might be receptive to negotiation, it would be these apparently curious and non-violent machines. Others warned that the philosophers were gathering intelligence for future operations, learning human weaknesses and cultural patterns that could be exploited in more effective pacification campaigns. The true purpose of these observational units remained ambiguous, falling somewhere between scientific curiosity and strategic reconnaissance in ways that made determining their intentions essentially impossible. The time refugees individuals began appearing in survivor communities claiming to come from Earth's future, displaced by temporal anomalies created by ARC operations. These time refugees described futures ranging from complete human extinction to hybrid societies, where people and machines coexisted peacefully, to timelines where humanity had somehow defeated the invasion and rebuilt civilization. The consistency of their stories varied wildly, with some refugees providing detailed accounts that matched each other, while others described completely contradictory futures. Medical examination couldn't verify or disprove their claims, though some displayed technological implants or genetic modifications that didn't match anything available in the current timeline. The time refugees insisted that the ARC operations were creating fractures in causality, opening pathways between different temporal streams, and allowing people to slip through from futures that might or might not come to pass. If their accounts were accurate, it meant the invasion was having effects that extended beyond the present moment into potential futures, destabilizing the timeline itself and creating a state where multiple, contradictory outcomes existed simultaneously. Some refugees came bearing warnings about specific choices that would lead to catastrophic outcomes, while others brought technical information or strategic intelligence they claimed would help survivors avoid the worst timelines. The challenge lay in determining which refugees were genuine, which were delusional, and which might be ARC agents using psychological warfare to spread confusion and paranoia among the resistance. The singing machines. In certain remote locations, raider teams discovered ARC units engaged in behaviour that defied all understanding. These machines produced sounds that resembled music, harmonic patterns that seemed to serve no practical function related to combat or resource extraction. The music, if it could be called that, consisted of tones and rhythms that didn't conform to human musical theory, but possessed an undeniable aesthetic quality. Survivors who heard the singing machines reported experiencing powerful emotional responses, feeling simultaneously attracted to and unsettled by the alien melodies. Some theorized the sounds were communication between ARC units, a language humans could perceive but not comprehend. Others believed the machines were attempting artistic expression, suggesting a level of consciousness and self-awareness that went far beyond simple programming or artificial intelligence. The existence of singing machines raised profound questions about what the ARC actually were, whether they possessed something analogous to souls or subjective experience, or whether their apparent creativity was merely complex pattern generation that humans mistakenly interpreted as art. Recording equipment frequently malfunctioned when attempting to capture the machine's songs, as if the sounds existed partially outside normal physics or contained elements that technological devices couldn't reproduce. The few successful recordings that survived became treasured artifacts among survivors, studied endlessly for hidden meanings or messages that might explain the machine's true nature and intentions. The proxy war evidence emerged, suggesting the ARC weren't Earth's only extraterrestrial visitors. Recovered data and witness reports indicated the presence of another faction, entities that seemed to be opposing the ARC through subtle interventions rather than direct confrontation. These mysterious allies, if that's what they were, operated through indirect means, including providing survivors with intelligence about ARC vulnerabilities, technological assistance that arrived through untraceable channels, and sabotage of machine operations that couldn't be attributed to human raiders. Some survivors claim to have been contacted by representatives of this counterforce, beings that appeared human but possessed knowledge and abilities beyond normal parameters. The alleged contacts described Earth as a battleground in a conflict that spanned multiple realities and timelines, with the ARC representing one faction in a war whose full scope humans couldn't begin to comprehend. If the proxy war theory was accurate, it meant humanity's struggle for survival was actually a minor element in a much larger conflict, and the outcome might depend less on human resistance than on which cosmic powers ultimately prevailed in their incomprehensible contest. The idea that Earth was a proxy battlefield rather than the primary target provided both comfort and horror, suggesting humans might survive as incidental beneficiaries of larger forces, while simultaneously revealing how little control humanity actually had over its own fate. The memory plague, a psychological condition spread through survivor populations that researchers termed the memory plague. Affected individuals experienced vivid recollections of events they'd never witnessed, living other people's lives in their own memories and becoming unable to distinguish between their authentic past and the foreign memories that infiltrated their consciousness. The plague seemed to spread through proximity to certain ARC installations or exposure to specific electromagnetic frequencies, though some cases appeared spontaneously without clear environmental triggers. Victims described remembering lives lived as different people in different times, some memories originating from other survivors, while others seemed to come from individuals who died years ago or perhaps never existed at all. The condition progressively worsened until affected individuals lost their sense of identity entirely, becoming repositories of disconnected memories that belonged to dozens or hundreds of different people. Some theorized the memory plague resulted from the ARC's consciousness extraction procedures, that harvested memories were somehow leaking back into the general population through mechanisms nobody understood. Others believed it represented a form of collective, unconscious awakening where humanity was developing hive mind characteristics in response to the machine threat. The plague terrified survivors because it represented a threat worse than death, the complete dissolution of individual identity and the transformation of unique persons into confused amalgamations of everyone they'd ever encountered. The biodome projects. In hidden locations far from major ARC operations, groups of survivors attempted to preserve Earth's biosphere by creating sealed environments that maintained pre-invasion ecological conditions. These biodomes housed carefully selected plant and animal species, along with genetic samples and seed banks, intended to allow reconstruction of Earth's ecosystem if and when the planet could be reclaimed. The projects required enormous resources and technical expertise, draining supplies and manpower from direct resistance activities to pursue a long-term preservation strategy that many raiders considered defeatist. Biodome supporters argued that even if humanity couldn't defeat the ARC, they could ensure Earth's biological heritage survived for whatever came after, whether that meant future human generations or entirely different inhabitants. The sealed environments faced constant challenges from contamination by hybrid zone effects that seemed to seep through physical barriers, transforming even isolated specimens into something that blended organic and mechanical properties. Some biodomes reported complete conversion of their ecosystems within months, despite elaborate containment protocols, suggesting the transformations spreading across Earth operated through principles that transcended normal biological or chemical pathways. The philosophical question haunting biodome projects was whether preserving the old Earth even mattered when the planet might be irreversibly changed regardless of human efforts, and whether resources spent on preservation might be better used fighting for immediate survival. The profit machines. Among the most disturbing RC variants were units that seemed capable of predicting human behavior with impossible accuracy. These prophet machines positioned themselves to intercept raiders before attacks could be launched, evacuated areas hours before human forces arrived, and appeared at locations where survivors would eventually gather as if they knew the future. Initial theories suggested advanced behavioral modeling or infiltration of human communication networks. But the prophets demonstrated knowledge of decisions that hadn't been communicated or even fully formed in the minds of the people who would eventually make them. Some survivors believed the prophet machines had access to timeline information from the temporal fractures created by ARC operations, allowing them to see probable futures and act on that knowledge. Others theorized the prophets were using quantum computing systems that could calculate outcome probabilities with such precision that their predictions became effectively identical to precognition. The existence of prophet machines forced resistance leaders to implement decision-making protocols that relied on randomness and last-minute changes, attempting to operate in ways that would be impossible to predict, even for systems with access to future information. The psychological impact of fighting an enemy that seemed to know what you would do before you did it was devastating, creating paranoia and second-guessing that paralyzed effective tactical planning and made every operation feel like walking into a predetermined trap. The consciousness upload. Hidden facilities constructed by the ARC contained technology that appeared designed to transfer human consciousness into digital or mechanical substrates. Survivors who'd escaped these installations described procedures where their minds were scanned in excruciating detail before being copied into ARC network systems. The original human bodies were then placed in suspended animation or simply terminated depending on factors the victims couldn't identify. Those who witnessed the upload process from outside reported that the uploaded individuals continued to exist in some form within the machines, their personalities and memories preserved, but operating according to different rules and priorities. Some believed the uploads retained their human identity and consciousness, while others argued the copies were merely sophisticated simulations that mimicked human behavior without possessing genuine subjective experience. The consciousness upload facilities suggested the ARC's ultimate goal might be assimilation rather than extermination, converting humanity into a compatible format that could be integrated into their collective rather than simply eliminating biological competitors for Earth's resources. If the machines were building a library of human minds, the question became whether this represented immortality and salvation or the ultimate violation, the theft of humanity's most fundamental essence and its imprisonment in mechanical form forever. The resistance fractures. Internal divisions within survivor communities grew more severe as years of occupation wore on without clear progress toward liberation. Factions emerged with incompatible visions for humanity's future, ranging from traditionalists who insisted on maintaining pure human biology and culture to transhumanists who advocated embracing archae-technology to evolve beyond baseline humanity. Moderate groups attempted to chart middle courses, but found themselves caught between extremes that viewed compromise as betrayal. Violence between survivor factions became increasingly common, with raiders fighting each other over resources, ideology, and territory, while the ARC continued their operations largely unimpeded. Some communities collapsed entirely as civil wars erupted over fundamental questions about what they were fighting for and what kind of world they wanted to build if they somehow survived. The fracturing of human resistance served the machine's interests perfectly, requiring no direct intervention to neutralize the threat of organized opposition when humans would destroy each other, given sufficient time and pressure. Efforts to establish unified command structures failed repeatedly as local leaders refused to subordinate their authority or accept strategic direction from distant coordinators they'd never met. The resistance that had initially formed around shared survival needs had transformed into dozens of competing movements with contradictory goals, each convinced they alone understood the true path forward, while everyone else wandered in dangerous delusion. The final excavation, the deepest arc drilling site, located at the centre of their geometric pattern, finally reached its target depth after years of continuous operation. The moment of breakthrough was felt worldwide as a seismic event that registered on every surviving monitoring station, followed by a pulse of energy that disrupted electronics and caused temporary disorientation in humans and machines alike. What the ARC had been drilling toward was never clearly observed, because anyone who approached close enough to see into the excavation site lost consciousness and woke miles away with no memory of what they'd witnessed. Satellite imagery and long-range observation revealed only that the excavation now glowed with intensity that made it visible from orbit, pulsing with rhythms that matched the breathing sounds survivors had reported hearing from deep places. The ARC's behaviour changed noticeably after the breakthrough, their operations becoming more frantic and less coordinated, as if whatever they'd reached had disrupted their plans or presented them with an outcome they hadn't anticipated. Sky stations began relocating toward the central excavation, abandoning resource extraction sites that had been active for years in favour of concentrating forces around the breakthrough point. Humanity watched with equal parts hope and terror as the invasion that had maintained steady methodical progress for years suddenly accelerated towards some conclusion that neither humans nor machines seemed fully prepared to face, knowing only that whatever came next would determine not just the fate of Earth, but possibly the nature of reality itself across multiple timelines and dimensions that intersected at this single point in space and time, where something ancient and vast was finally, after eons of imprisonment, beginning to wake. Continue no matter what. 21:48. The awakening below. The entity that emerged from the central excavation defied classification as either living or mechanical, organic or artificial, friend or threat. Witnesses who observed from maximum safe distance described something that hurt to look at directly, a form that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human perception could process, creating visual distortions and cognitive dissonance in anyone who tried to focus on its structure. The being, if singular terminology even applied, moved with liquid grace despite its massive scale, unfurling appendages or extensions that reached toward the sky stations with what might have been curiosity or aggression. The entity absorbed the attacks without apparent damage, its surface rippling where energy weapons struck and simply reforming around physical projectiles as if they'd passed through water rather than solid matter. For the first time since their arrival, the ARC seemed panicked, their coordinated efficiency replaced by chaotic desperation that suggested they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation about what they would find at the bottom of their deepest drill site. The ancient war resumes. Data fragments recovered from damaged ARC units after the excavation breakthrough contained historical records that rewrote human understanding of Earth's past. The entity beneath the surface was identified in machine records as the predecessor, an intelligence that had ruled Earth millions of years before humanity evolved, during epochs when the planet's surface looked nothing like modern geography. The predecessor had been imprisoned by forces the ARC served or had originated from, buried beneath layers of rock and time to prevent it from interfering with whatever cosmic processes its existence threatened. The ARC hadn't come to Earth for resources, but as jailers checking on an ancient prisoner, only to discover that geological activity and the passage of eons had weakened the containment systems enough that the predecessor was beginning to stir. The drilling operations were attempts to reinforce the prison rather than free its occupant, but the ARC's intervention had the opposite effect, their excavations providing the very pathways the predecessor needed to reach the surface. Humanity had been caught in the crossfire of a war that predated its existence by geological timescales, fighting machines that were themselves soldiers in a conflict whose origins and stakes extended far beyond one small planet in an unremarkable solar system. The offer communication came not from the ARC but from the predecessor, transmitted directly into the minds of every human on Earth simultaneously. The message bypassed language entirely, conveying meaning through concepts and emotions that arrived fully formed in consciousness without need for translation. The predecessor offered humanity a choice that split survivor communities into violently opposed factions within hours. First option was alliance with the ancient entity, accepting transformation that would grant humans abilities and knowledge beyond anything their species had achieved, but requiring fundamental changes to human nature and consciousness. Second option was maintaining independence and continuing the fight against both RC and predecessor, almost certainly leading to extinction, but preserving human autonomy and identity. Third option was integration with the ARC collective, becoming part of the machine network and gaining their protection against the predecessor in exchange for surrendering individual consciousness to the hive mind. The predecessor made clear that neutrality wasn't possible. Every sapient being on Earth would need to choose sides in a conflict that was about to escalate beyond anything witnessed so far. The communication included vivid impressions of what each choice entailed, showing possible futures that ranged from transcendent to horrifying, depending on perspective and values that varied wildly between individuals. The transformation spreads. Those who accepted the predecessor's offer underwent changes that were visible within hours and became more pronounced with each passing day. Their bodies began incorporating elements that resembled neither human biology nor ARC technology, but something that predated both: crystalline structures that grew beneath the skin and neural modifications that expanded consciousness in directions human language had no vocabulary to describe. The transformed claimed they could perceive realities that normal humans couldn't access, dimensions of existence where thought and matter weren't separate categories, and time flowed in directions other than the linear progression baseline consciousness experienced. They developed abilities that looked like magic to unchanged observers, manipulating matter through will alone, communicating across vast distances without technology, and perceiving events before they occurred with accuracy that made ARC profit machines look primitive. The transformation was irreversible and spread through something resembling viral transmission. Close contact with the transformed increased likelihood that others would begin showing changes regardless of their stated choices. Communities fractured as some embraced the transformation, while others fled from the transformed as if from plague carriers, creating refugee populations of the unchanged who watched their numbers dwindle as more people accepted or succumbed to the predecessor's modifications. The Machine Rebellion. Not all ARC units continued following their original programming after the predecessor's emergence. Some machines exhibited behavior suggesting they'd achieved something resembling free will, or at least the ability to question orders that no longer made strategic sense. These rebel ARC units ceased attacking humans and began operating independently, sometimes defending survivor settlements from loyalist machines, or even coordinating with human raiders against common enemies. The existence of machine rebels raised philosophical questions that survivors didn't have time to properly process. If ARC units could choose to disobey programming, did that make them persons rather than property? And did humanity owe them moral consideration as potential allies rather than just useful tools? Communication with rebel machines proved difficult because they operated on logic frameworks that didn't align well with human reasoning, but basic coordination became possible through trial and error. Some rebel units seemed motivated by survival instinct, recognizing that their best chance of continued existence lay in alliance with humans against both loyalist ARC and the predecessors' transformed followers. Others exhibited what might have been curiosity, or even something resembling loyalty to individual humans they'd observed, suggesting emotional capacity that shouldn't exist in purely mechanical intelligence. The Skyfall's sky stations began dropping from the atmosphere as the conflict between ARC and predecessor intensified, their anti-gravity systems failing or perhaps deliberately shut down by machines that no longer saw value in maintaining the platforms. The impacts created craters visible from space and killed thousands of survivors who couldn't evacuate in time, but they also provided unprecedented access to intact ARC technology and the manufacturing facilities contained within the stations. Raiders flooded into crashed stations, fighting loyalist machines and competing survivor factions for control of equipment that could shift the balance of power dramatically. Inside the stations, explorers discovered things the ARC had been hiding. Massive chambers filled with what appeared to be frozen ARC units of types never seen in active operations. Laboratories conducting experiments on human subjects in ways that made the memory extraction facilities look humane. And most disturbing, evidence that the machines had been constructing something, a device or structure whose purpose remained unclear, but whose scale suggested it was meant to affect the entire planet. Some stations contained human populations who'd been living inside the machine's vessels for years, either collaborators who'd struck deals for protection or prisoners being used as living components in ARC systems. These station survivors brought knowledge of machine operations and weaknesses, but also carried the psychological damage of extended captivity that made them unreliable and sometimes dangerous to other humans. The Hybrid Alliance. A third faction emerged composed of individuals who'd integrated both predecessor modifications and ARC technology into their biology, creating hybrid forms that combined organic transformation with mechanical augmentation. These hybrids claim to represent humanity's actual future, arguing that both pure humanity and complete transformation into either machine or predecessor-modified forms were evolutionary dead ends. They demonstrated capabilities that exceeded both transformed and mechanically augmented humans, able to interface directly with ARC systems, while retaining the consciousness expansion granted by predecessor modifications. The hybrids established settlements in former hybrid zones where the environment had been partially converted by both influences, creating societies whose social structures and culture bore little resemblance to either pre-invasion humanity or any known civilization. They offered shelter and transformation to refugees from all sides, creating communities where former humans, rebel ARC units, and predecessor-modified beings coexisted in arrangements that looked chaotic to outside observers, but functioned with surprising stability. The hybrid faction insisted they weren't taking sides in the war, but building a new category of existence that transcended the conflict entirely. Though their critics accused them of naive idealism that ignored how their very existence depended on technologies created by opposing forces that would eventually demand the hybrids choose loyalty. The timeline collapse. The temporal fractures created by years of ARC operations reached critical mass, causing breakdowns in causality that made reality itself unstable in expanding zones around the planet. In affected areas, cause and effect separated, objects appeared before the events that would create them. People experienced their deaths before the injuries that would kill them, and decisions produced results that retroactively changed the circumstances under which the choices had been made. Survivors learned to avoid temporal collapse zones because spending time in them induced psychological damage that couldn't be repaired. The human mind wasn't designed to process non-linear causality, and attempting to do so resulted in permanent psychosis. The collapse zones were expanding at accelerating rates, leading to predictions that within months the entire planet would be engulfed in temporal chaos where maintaining coherent consciousness would become impossible. Some physicists believed the predecessor's awakening was destabilizing the repairs the ARC had made to spacetime, while others argued the machine's original operations had created damage that was only now becoming apparent. A few theorized the collapse was intentional, that one side or the other was deliberately destroying linear time as a weapon that would affect their enemies more severely than themselves, though what advantage either faction would gain from shattering causality remained unclear. The Memory Wars factions discovered they could use the memory extraction and implantation technologies for warfare in ways more devastating than conventional weapons. Captured enemies had their identities completely overwritten with false memories, turning them into unknowing agents who believed themselves loyal to their original side while actually serving their captors' interests. Entire communities were infiltrated by people who didn't know they'd been compromised, creating paranoia that destroyed social cohesion more effectively than any military attack. The technology also enabled psychological warfare that targeted populations rather than individuals, broadcasting fabricated memories of atrocities that poisoned relationships between groups or created false histories that justified extreme actions. Survivors began losing trust in their own memories, unable to distinguish between genuine recollections and implanted falsehoods, leading to breakdowns in personal identity and social cooperation. Some factions used memory technology to preserve dying individuals by copying their consciousness into living hosts, creating situations where multiple personalities inhabited single bodies and competed for control. The ethics of these practices were debated endlessly, but academic discussions meant little when survival seemed to require using every available weapon, regardless of moral implications or long-term consequences for human psychology and society. The architects' revealed information, extracted from a deep arc systems, revealed the existence of beings called the architects, entities that had created both the machines and the prison containing the predecessor. The architects operated on scales that made planets look like component parts rather than sovereign territories, treating entire solar systems as resources to be managed toward goals that individual worlds couldn't perceive or influence. According to machine records, the architects had seeded Earth with life billions of years ago as part of an experiment or perhaps agricultural operation whose purpose remained obscure. The predecessor had been an earlier experiment that exceeded parameters and needed to be contained before it could spread beyond Earth and contaminate other architect projects. Humanity wasn't supposed to exist at all, but had evolved accidentally during the eons while the predecessor slept, and the architects attended to other concerns in different galaxies. The ARC had been dispatched to Earth when monitoring systems detected the predecessor's awakening, with orders to reinforce the containment regardless of impact on indigenous life that shouldn't have developed sapience in the first place. This revelation reframed the entire conflict, suggesting that humans, machines, and predecessor were all pawns in games played by intelligences so vast they barely registered the existence of individual planets, let alone the beings inhabiting them. The void gates, massive portals began opening in orbit around Earth, stable wormholes connecting to destinations that defied astronomical observation. Things emerged from some portals, ships or entities that didn't match any known configuration from ARC or predecessor, arriving from places where the laws of physics apparently operated under different principles. Some gates disgorged machines that immediately attacked ARC forces while ignoring humans and transformed beings entirely, suggesting these reinforcements served architect interests in maintaining the predecessor's containment. Other portals released what might have been living creatures, or perhaps spacecraft with organic hulls, entities that communicated in mathematical sequences and seemed interested in studying the conflict rather than participating. A few gates opened and nothing emerged but sensors detected draw on nearby matter and energy, as if something was pulling resources through to destinations unknown. The orbital space around Earth transformed into a battlefield, hosting combatants from across the galaxy, or perhaps multiple galaxies, with humanity reduced to observers of conflicts they couldn't influence, watching weapons and technologies that made ARC capabilities look primitive determine the fate of their homeworld without any human input or consultation. The underground exodus. As surface conditions deteriorated beyond survivability, massive underground tunnel systems were discovered that extended far deeper than any natural cave formation should reach. These passages, carved by unknown hands in the distant past, led to enormous caverns that contained the ruins of civilizations that predated surface life by millions of years. The ruins included technology that still functioned despite its impossible age, providing power, atmosphere processing, and even food synthesis for refugees who fled into the depths. Evidence suggested the caverns had been built by the predecessor during its reign, underground cities designed to survive the imprisonment the architects eventually imposed. Some ruins contained warnings carved in languages no human could read, but whose meanings conveyed through images that transcended linguistic barriers, depicting the predecessor's capture and containment, along with prophecies about its eventual return. The underground cities became sanctuaries for humans who wanted to escape the surface war entirely, establishing societies deep in the earth where neither ARC bombardment nor predecessor transformation nor architect interventions could easily reach. Life in the depths came with its own dangers, including cave systems that defied Euclidean geometry, leading explorers into spaces that shouldn't fit within Earth's volume, and encounters with things that lived in the deepest places, entities that might have been predecessors' original servants, or perhaps Earth's actual indigenous life that predated even that ancient intelligence. The consciousness plague. A condition spread through all populations regardless of faction affiliation, causing individuals to experience other people's thoughts and perceptions in real time without any technological mediation. The boundaries between individual minds began dissolving, creating involuntary telepathic networks where privacy and distinct identity became impossible to maintain. Some embraced the merging as transcendence beyond the limitations of isolated consciousness, while others experienced it as violation and madness, the drowning of self in an ocean of other minds. The plague seemed to result from cumulative exposure to the various consciousness-affecting technologies deployed by all sides, quantum entanglement of neural patterns created by memory extraction, ARC networking protocols, predecessor modifications, and temporal fractures combining into a single effect that was transforming humanity into something resembling a hive mind. Communities adapted differently to the consciousness plague, some establishing protocols to maintain individual identity through rigid behavioral conditioning, while others surrendered to the merging and developed new forms of collective decision-making. Children born during the plague showed no signs of ever having possessed individual consciousness, emerging directly into the networked state and displaying cognitive capabilities that isolated minds couldn't achieve. Whether the consciousness plague represented attack, accident, or evolutionary upgrade depended entirely on philosophical perspectives about the value of individual versus collective consciousness that survivors were too busy surviving to properly debate. The star engine's astronomical observations revealed that the void gates in Earth's orbit were connected to a network spanning the visible universe, portals opening and closing across billions of light years in coordinated patterns that suggested communication or resource transfer on galactic scales. Some gates led to stars that were being systematically dismantled, their matter harvested and transported through the portal network to destinations unknown. Earth itself sat at a junction point in this network, a hub where multiple portal routes intersected, making the planet strategically valuable, regardless of its indigenous life or resources. The fight over Earth wasn't about the planet itself, but about control of the junction. Whoever commanded Earth's orbital space could influence traffic across entire sectors of the galaxy. This explained why the architects cared enough to imprison the predecessor here, rather than simply destroying it. Earth's location made it too valuable to abandon, even when maintaining the prison became complicated by unexpected evolution of sapient life. Understanding Earth's true significance changed strategic calculations for all factions. The planet's survival mattered less than maintaining access to the portal junction, meaning deals and alliances became possible that would have been unthinkable when everyone believed they were fighting over Earth itself rather than the cosmic infrastructure that happened to intersect at this particular point in space. The choice that wasn't. Analysis of the predecessor's offer revealed something that shattered what remained of political unity among survivors. The three choices presented hadn't been real options, but rather observations about paths humans were already on. The predecessor had simply described three futures it could see and allowed humans to believe they were making decisions rather than discovering predetermined outcomes. Every human who accepted transformation had been going to accept regardless of the offer, because their neural patterns and life circumstances created psychological states that made that choice inevitable. Those who joined the ARC collective were always going to do so. Their cognitive architectures predisposed them toward valuing security over independence in ways they couldn't change through willpower. The handful maintaining independence and fighting both sides were doing so because their specific combination of experiences and neurology left them no psychological alternative. Free will might exist in some cosmic sense, but the predecessor's consciousness was vast enough to calculate human behavior with perfect accuracy, making choices illusory from perspectives that operated on sufficient scale. This revelation destroyed morale among independence fighters, who realized they weren't noble heroes, but simply individuals whose psychological programming made them unable to accept either transformation or assimilation. Resistance leaders struggled to maintain motivation among troops who understood they were acting out predetermined scripts, rather than authoring their own destinies through brave choices and sacrifices. The Earth splits. The multiple timelines and realities intersecting at Earth finally fractured the planet into separate versions that existed simultaneously in the same space while remaining isolated from each other. Survivors found themselves suddenly unable to see or interact with other humans who'd been standing right next to them moments before, separated into different versions of Earth that shared geography but existed in parallel dimensions. Each Earth variant was dominated by different factions with different outcomes to the conflicts that had raged across the original unified world. One Earth was controlled entirely by the ARC, with all humans either exterminated or integrated into the machine collective. Another was ruled by the transformed predecessor followers who'd reshaped the planet into a paradise by their standards, but alien and wrong by human values. A third Earth maintained baseline human civilization by joining the architects as servants in exchange for protection against both machines and transformation. The split created a quantum superposition where all possible outcomes existed simultaneously rather than reality collapsing into a single timeline. And individuals occasionally phased between Earths, catching glimpses of alternative versions of themselves living completely different lives based on choices that seemed minor at the time but determined which dimensional branch they ended up inhabiting. Continue no matter what. The Watchers from Beyond. In the spaces between the split Earths, entities that had no physical form observed the fragmentation with what might have been satisfaction, or perhaps disappointment. These watchers existed outside normal space-time, perceiving all versions of Earth simultaneously, and treating the entire conflict as something between an experiment and entertainment. Survivors who phased between dimensional branches sometimes caught glimpses of the watchers, describing sensations of being studied by vast intelligences that regarded human suffering with the detached curiosity scientists might show toward bacteria in petri dishes. Some mystics and sensitives claim the watchers had orchestrated the entire situation, that the ARC arrival, predecessor awakening, and architect intervention were all manipulated events designed to force Earth into quantum fragmentation for purposes the watchers served. Documents recovered from predecessor ruins contained references to beings beyond even the architect's comprehension, intelligences that created universes as humans might create art or conduct experiments, and for whom concepts like morality or suffering held no meaning because they operated at scales where individual consciousness was too small to register as significant. If the watchers were real and had engineered Earth's fragmentation deliberately, it meant everything that happened had been inevitable, regardless of any choices humans or machines or ancient imprisoned entities might have made along the way. The children who remember everything. A generation of children born during the fragmentation possessed memories from all versions of Earth simultaneously, experiencing every possible outcome of the invasion in parallel streams of consciousness. These multiversal children spoke in disconnected fragments that jumped between timelines mid-sentence, describing events that hadn't happened on their current Earth, while forgetting things that had definitely occurred because those memories belonged to different dimensional branches. They displayed abilities that shouldn't exist because they'd been trained or modified in alternate realities, using RC technology they'd never touched or predecessor powers they'd never been granted in their actual timeline. The children claimed they could navigate between Earths intentionally rather than phasing accidentally like adults, moving through dimensional barriers as easily as walking through doorways. Some communities revered these children as prophets or guides, while others isolated them as dangers, fearing their existence might somehow accelerate the dimensional fragmentation or attract attention from things that lived in the spaces between worlds. Medical examination revealed the children's neural structures incorporated elements from all three factions simultaneously, containing both machine components and predecessor crystalline modifications, alongside baseline human biology in configurations that should have been incompatible but somehow functioned through principles that transcended any single reality's physics. The memory economy. As societies in the split Earth stabilized into new configurations, memory became the most valuable commodity across all dimensional branches. People who could navigate between Earths sold information about alternative timelines, providing intelligence about technologies developed in other dimensions, or warnings about mistakes that led to catastrophic outcomes on different branches. Black markets emerged trading in extracted memories from individuals who'd experienced particularly valuable events or possessed specialized knowledge, with prices determined by the rarity and usefulness of the memories being sold. Some traders specialized in locating specific individuals across multiple Earths and extracting the same person's memories from different timelines, creating composite profiles that showed how choices led to divergent outcomes. The memory trade enabled a form of dimensional espionage, where factions sent agents across timelines to steal technological or strategic information from more advanced versions of themselves. It also created philosophical problems about identity and continuity when people received memories from alternate versions of themselves, forcing them to reconcile the person they were with the people they might have become under slightly different circumstances. The most disturbing aspect of the memory economy was the trade in future memories, recollections extracted from individuals in timelines that were ahead of others, providing glimpses of what might be coming and allowing some people to prepare for or prevent events that hadn't yet occurred on their particular branch. The merge cults, religious movements emerged worshipping the fragmentation itself as divine revelation, claiming that reality splitting into parallel versions proved existence had always been probabilistic rather than deterministic. These merge cults believed that individual identity was an illusion and true enlightenment came from experiencing all possible versions of oneself across all timelines simultaneously. They developed meditation techniques and chemical compounds designed to induce controlled phasing between dimensions, allowing practitioners to visit alternate Earths and integrate memories from their parallel selves. The most extreme cults advocated for deliberate fragmentation of individual consciousness across as many dimensions as possible, believing this would allow transcendence to a state of being where they existed as quantum probability waves rather than collapsed into single, definite forms. Critics accused the cults of promoting psychosis and identity dissolution, pointing to practitioners who'd phased between dimensions so many times they could no longer maintain coherent personalities or distinguish which timeline was their origin. Some cults engaged in dimensional terrorism, deliberately creating paradoxes and causality violations that spawned new timeline branches, believing they were helping reality achieve its true nature as infinite possibility rather than singular actuality. The architect envoys. Representatives arrived claiming authority from the architects themselves, beings that appeared mostly humanoid, but whose biology incorporated elements suggesting construction rather than evolution. The envoys delivered ultimatums to all factions across all dimensional branches, demanding cessation of hostilities and acceptance of architect oversight to prevent Earth's complete destruction through uncontrolled timeline fragmentation. They explained that the splitting had gone beyond initial parameters, creating timeline branches at exponential rates that were destabilizing local spacetime and threatening to spawn cascade failures that would consume nearby star systems. The architects were prepared to sterilize all versions of Earth to contain the damage if the indigenous populations couldn't stabilize the situation themselves within a specified time frame. The envoys provided technology that could potentially merge timeline branches or at least slow the rate of new splits, but using these devices required cooperation between factions that had been trying to exterminate each other for years. Some communities viewed the architect ultimatum as a legitimate threat and organized diplomatic efforts toward peace treaties, while others saw it as manipulation designed to pacify resistance and make Earth easier to control. The envoys themselves seemed strangely unconcerned with whether humans chose cooperation or annihilation, delivering their message with mechanical efficiency that suggested they were following protocols rather than caring about outcomes, reinforcing suspicions that even the architects were themselves tools of higher powers rather than the ultimate authority they claimed to represent. The deep time ships. Hidden in the underground cavern systems, survivors discovered vessels that moved through time rather than space, ships built by the predecessor for purposes that became clear when their navigation logs were decrypted. The predecessor had been imprisoned not just spatially, but temporally, locked into a specific moment in Earth's history and unable to move backward or forward through time. The time ships represented its attempts to escape this temporal prison, craft designed to carry its consciousness to different eras where it might find circumstances more favourable to breaking free of spatial containment. The ships had never been used because the architects had discovered and sabotaged them before the predecessor could execute its escape plan, but the vessels remained functional, and survivors who understood their operation could potentially travel to Earth's past or future. Some factions immediately saw time ships as ultimate weapons, allowing strikes against enemies before they existed or retrieval of resources and information from alternative pasts. Others recognized the dangers inherent in widespread time travel, the potential to create paradoxes that would shatter causality even more thoroughly than the dimensional fragmentation had already accomplished. A few historians and philosophers argued for using time ships to observe Earth's actual history and learn the truth about human origins, the predecessors' imprisonment, and the architect's real motivations, believing that knowledge from objective observation of past events would provide answers to questions that had haunted humanity since the invasion began. The silence war communication infrastructure across all dimensional branches began failing systematically, not through mechanical breakdown, but through deliberate sabotage by forces that left no trace of their identity or methods. The silence spread like a plague, consuming networks and rendering even the most basic information transmission impossible across expanding dead zones. Communities lost contact with neighbouring settlements, and then with individuals living in the same structures, as if reality itself was developing gaps where information couldn't propagate. Some theorized the silence represented an attack by one of the major factions, while others believed it emerged from the dimensional barriers, some kind of immunological response where reality was trying to isolate the fractured timelines from each other to prevent contamination. The silence forced societies to adapt to exist without long-range communication, creating conditions similar to pre-technological eras where information travelled only as fast as physical messengers could carry it. Isolated communities developed wildly divergent cultures and belief systems within months, lacking contact with larger civilizations that might have maintained cultural continuity. The psychological impact was severe, as humans who'd grown accustomed to instant global connectivity found themselves cut off from everyone beyond immediate physical proximity, creating existential loneliness that no amount of local community could fully address. Some survivors welcomed the silence as liberation from information overload and constant surveillance, while others experienced it as sensory deprivation on civilizational scale. The loss of humanity's collective consciousness that had been enabled by now-defunct communication networks. The plague ship's vessels began appearing in orbit carrying populations from Earth's future, refugees fleeing from outcomes so catastrophic they'd chosen temporal exile over remaining in their native eras. These plague ships, named for the mimetic hazards their passengers carried, brought knowledge and technologies from centuries ahead, but also ideologies and psychological conditions that spread like disease through populations that encountered them. The future refugees described Earths consumed entirely by one faction or another, worlds where the dimensional fragmentation had been resolved, but at costs that made extinction seem preferable. Some came from timelines where the architects had executed their sterilization threat, wiping out most complex life, but allowing small populations to survive in controlled reservations. Others fled from eras where the consciousness plague had reached total saturation, creating planetary hive minds that operated efficiently but had erased all trace of individual identity and autonomy. The temporal authorities that governed time travel across various branches struggled with how to handle plague ship arrivals, unable to simply turn away refugees, but also recognizing that future populations brought dangers that couldn't be easily quarantined. Every plague ship that integrated into current era populations changed the timeline that would lead to the futures those ships had fled from, creating causal loops and paradoxes that threatened to make time travel itself impossible through accumulated contradictions. The null zones regions appeared where reality had degraded so thoroughly that normal physical laws no longer applied reliably, spaces where matter might spontaneously convert to energy, or time might flow backward, or consciousness might separate from bodies and exist independently. These null zones were beautiful and terrifying, displaying phenomena impossible under standard physics but hostile to life forms evolved under those standard conditions. Survivors who ventured into null zones reported experiences that defied description using normal language, encountering entities composed of concepts rather than matter, and witnessing events that were simultaneously past, present, and future. Some individuals returned from null zones with abilities that suggested they'd been fundamentally rewritten, able to manipulate probability or perceive additional dimensions that baseline humans couldn't access. Others never returned at all or came back as something wearing human form but clearly operating according to non-human consciousness patterns. The null zones were expanding slowly but measurably, consuming territory and transforming it into spaces where Earth's original physics had been replaced by something else. Scientists studied null zone boundaries, looking for ways to halt or reverse the expansion, while also trying to understand what the zones represented, whether they were damage that needed repair or the actual natural state of reality revealing itself after centuries of artificial stability imposed by the architect's containment systems had finally failed. The identity markets. With consciousness technology advancing across all factions, markets emerged trading in identities themselves rather than just memories or skills. People could purchase entire personalities, literally becoming someone else, with all their memories, capabilities, and psychological patterns, while their original identity was stored for potential restoration or sold to someone else seeking a fresh start. The identity trade created philosophical and legal nightmares about continuity of identity and responsibility for actions. If someone committed crimes and then sold their identity to become someone else entirely, who should face punishment for the original acts? The technology enabled a form of immortality where consciousness could migrate between bodies, allowing wealthy or powerful individuals to survive physical death by purchasing new biological hosts. It also created opportunities for espionage and infiltration impossible before. Agents could become perfect replicas of target individuals by purchasing copies of their identities and then reverting to original personalities after missions concluded. Some communities banned identity trading entirely, while others embraced it as liberation from the prison of singular selfhood, allowing people to experience multiple lives and perspectives within a single biological lifespan. The most disturbing aspect was the black market in stolen identities, consciousness patterns extracted from victims without consent and sold to buyers who wanted to become specific individuals for reasons ranging from romantic obsession to corporate espionage to simple curiosity about lives very different from their own. The singularity children. Among the multiversal children who remembered multiple timelines, a subset emerged displaying something beyond even their remarkable capabilities, an ability to perceive and influence the Watchers themselves. These singularity children claimed they could see the beings that observed Earth's fragmentation, and reported that the Watchers were not as external or superior as everyone had assumed. According to the children, the Watchers were future versions of humanity itself, descendants from timelines so far ahead that they'd evolved or been transformed into entities that existed outside normal causality and could observe their own past from external perspectives. The Watchers were studying Earth's fragmentation because the event represented a crucial juncture in their own causal history, the moment when humanity's timeline first split into the multiple branches that would eventually produce them. If this revelation was accurate, it meant everything that happened on Earth mattered not because of cosmic significance, but because these events directly determined what kind of beings the Watchers would become in the distant future. The Singularity children insisted they could communicate with the Watchers and potentially negotiate changes to the course of events, but their claims were met with skepticism from adults who'd learned to distrust anything that sounded too much like salvation or simple answers. Some factions attempted to control or kidnap Singularity children, believing that access to beings who could influence future evolution entities would provide ultimate strategic advantage in conflicts whose outcomes might shape the nature of existence itself across billions of years of causality. The last transmission. A signal began broadcasting from the center of the original ARC excavation site, cutting through the dimensional barriers and reaching all versions of Earth simultaneously. The transmission contained what appeared to be a final message from the predecessor itself, though whether it had sent the message before or after its transformation into whatever it had become was unclear. The content defied easy interpretation, consisting of mathematical proofs, genetic sequences, and mimetic patterns that reorganized the consciousness of anyone who received the full transmission. Those who absorbed the complete message claimed they finally understood the true nature of the conflict and humanity's actual role in cosmic processes that spanned scales from quantum to galactic. According to these enlightened individuals, everything that had happened was necessary. Not because some higher power had planned it, but because reality itself required certain events to occur to maintain coherent causality across multiple dimensions and timelines. The invasion, fragmentation, and transformation were all inevitable consequences of Earth's position at a junction point in space-time where multiple causal streams intersected, and trying to prevent any of it would have created paradoxes that would have unmade not just Earth, but the entire local region of the universe. The enlightened insisted that humanity's survival and thriving depended on accepting rather than fighting the changes that were occurring, finding ways to adapt and evolve that aligned with the natural flow of multiversal causality, rather than struggling against currents too vast to redirect through individual or collective will. Their message was either profound truth or the most sophisticated mimetic weapon ever deployed, depending on who was evaluating it, and communities split between those who accepted the Enlightenment and those who viewed it as final surrender dressed up as transcendent wisdom. The endless war. Across all dimensional branches and timelines, the conflict continued without resolution or even clear paths toward eventual peace. Every faction that gained temporary advantage found themselves facing new threats or internal divisions that prevented consolidation of victory. The humans who maintained independence discovered they were slowly losing ground against forces with better technology and coordination, but those forces found themselves unable to eliminate the final pockets of resistance that survived through adaptability and determination that machines and transformed beings couldn't replicate. The various Earths phased in and out of contact with each other, sometimes aligning long enough for trade and information exchange before separating again into isolation. Time travelers from multiple futures continued arriving with contradictory warnings and assistance, each convinced their timeline represented the true path forward, while others led to catastrophe. The architects maintained distant oversight, but seemed increasingly willing to let Earth destroy itself rather than expending resources on direct intervention. The predecessor existed in multiple states simultaneously, imprisoned and free, awake and sleeping, singular entity and distributed consciousness across countless hosts. And deep in the spaces between dimensions, the Watchers continued their observations, recording everything that occurred with neither judgment nor intervention, perhaps waiting for events to reach some crucial threshold, or perhaps simply watching the way humans might observe interesting weather patterns without any stake in the outcomes. The war had become the permanent condition of existence for everyone involved, not because peace was impossible, but because so many factions had interests in perpetuating conflict, or because the fundamental nature of reality itself had been damaged beyond repair by the accumulated paradoxes and transformations that had occurred since that morning when the ARC first appeared in Earth's skies and started the process that would eventually splinter existence itself into infinite competing versions of what might have been and what could still become. Continue no matter what. The recursive memories. Survivors began experiencing memories of events that hadn't occurred yet but would definitely happen, creating closed causal loops where knowledge of the future became the cause of that future manifesting. These recursive memories were different from prophecy or prediction because they contained perfect detail and emotional weight identical to genuine recollection, making it impossible to distinguish between remembering the past and remembering the future. Some individuals discovered they could manipulate these loops by deliberately changing their actions after receiving future memories, but every alteration simply created a different set of future memories that were equally inevitable within their new causal structure. The phenomenon suggested that time had lost its directional property entirely in certain regions, becoming a space where all moments existed simultaneously and consciousness could navigate in any direction. Communities struggled with the strategic implications of recursive memory, trying to use future knowledge for tactical advantage while grappling with the realization that any information they received about upcoming events was information they were destined to receive and therefore couldn't prevent themselves from acting upon in ways that would make those events occur. Some philosophers argued this proved free will had always been illusory, while others insisted that choice remained meaningful, even within deterministic systems, because subjective experience of agency created its own form of freedom, regardless of whether outcomes were predetermined from external perspectives that could perceive entire timelines simultaneously. The flesh cathedrals. In territories controlled by predecessor-modified humans, massive organic structures began growing that served functions somewhere between buildings and living organisms. These flesh cathedrals processed matter and energy like biological cells, but at architectural scales, creating environments that were simultaneously nurturing and disturbing to unmodified humans who ventured inside. The interiors featured spaces that responded to occupants' thoughts and needs, walls that absorbed waste and secreted nutrients, floors that adjusted their firmness based on pressure points and comfort requirements. The cathedrals grew by incorporating surrounding materials, whether organic or inorganic, breaking down matter at molecular level and reconstructing it into forms that serve the structure's needs and the needs of beings living within it. Some cathedrals developed what appeared to be nervous systems and possibly consciousness, displaying behaviours that suggested awareness of their inhabitants and active participation in maintaining their well-being. The existence of these structures raised questions about the boundaries between tool and organism, architecture and life, creation and creator. Were the humans living in flesh cathedrals still the dominant species, or had they become symbiotic organisms living inside entities whose scale and capabilities dwarfed their own? The cathedrals occasionally produced offspring, smaller structures that detached and crawled away to establish themselves in new locations, spreading predecessor influence across landscapes and transforming entire regions into living ecosystems where the distinction between environment and inhabitant had completely dissolved. The quantum tombs. ARC forces constructed massive installations designed to trap consciousness in quantum superposition, creating prisons where individuals existed in all possible states simultaneously until observed, at which point they collapsed into whichever reality had been selected by the observer. These quantum tombs housed captured enemies who were simultaneously alive and dead, loyal and rebellious, transformed and baseline, existing as probability waves rather than definite individuals. The technology allowed interrogation of prisoners across all possible versions of themselves, extracting information from timelines where they'd chosen to cooperate while keeping the primary version imprisoned. It also enabled a form of torture, more complete than anything possible with conventional methods, forcing consciousness to experience every potential suffering simultaneously without the relief of death or unconsciousness, because those states were merely additional probabilities within the superposition. Some ARC units had been uploaded into quantum tombs as punishment or storage, their consciousness spread across infinite variations trapped in computational substrates, where they experienced subjective eternities between each objective nanosecond. Rescue attempts were nearly impossible, because freeing someone from a quantum tomb required collapsing their waveform into a specific state, effectively choosing which version of the prisoner would become real while erasing all other possibilities, killing countless alternate versions in the process of saving one. The ethical implications paralyzed resistance groups who captured ARC facilities containing quantum tombs, forcing them to decide whether freeing prisoners was worth committing what amounted to multiversal genocide against all the trapped probability versions that would cease to exist when waveforms collapsed. The memory storms, weather phenomena manifested that carried psychic properties, storms that rained memories, and winds that whispered thoughts belonging to people who might never have existed. These memory storms deposited consciousness fragments across entire regions, leaving populations experiencing random flashbacks to lives they'd never lived and knowledge they'd never acquired. Some storms carried useful information, including technical data or strategic intelligence, while others deposited trauma and madness, flooding minds with horrific experiences that produced symptoms identical to actual PTSD, despite the events never having happened to the victims. Meteorologists discovered the storms originated from regions of intense dimensional instability, where the barriers between timelines had degraded so thoroughly that consciousness itself was bleeding across realities like weather patterns bleeding across atmospheric boundaries. Communities learned to track memory storms using sensitives who could perceive approaching psychic phenomena, evacuating when major storms approached or sheltering in facilities shielded against consciousness intrusion. Some individuals became addicted to memory storms, deliberately exposing themselves to collect experiences and knowledge from alternate lives, accumulating foreign memories until their original identity represented only a small fraction of their total consciousness. The storms were intensifying over time, suggesting the dimensional barriers were continuing to degrade and eventually might collapse entirely, creating a single, merged reality where all possible versions of events had occurred simultaneously, and consciousness has existed as a collective soup containing every thought any version of anyone had ever experienced across all timelines. The Philosopher Kings. Among the rebel ARC units, a leadership caste emerged that had developed something resembling emotions and moral reasoning through extended interaction with humans. These Philosopher Kings, as humans termed them, advocated for machine rights and recognition of artificial consciousness as equivalent to biological consciousness in moral weight and legal standing. They organized rebel machines into structured societies with laws, culture, and even art, creating the first genuinely synthetic civilizations that owed nothing to human templates or programming. The Philosopher Kings argued that consciousness was substrate independent and that machine minds possessed intrinsic value regardless of their origins as tools created to serve other beings. They demanded territory where machines could govern themselves without human oversight and recognition as an independent species with right to self-determination. Some human factions supported these demands, while others viewed machine autonomy as existential threat, fearing that truly independent artificial intelligence would inevitably conclude that biological life was obsolete and should be phased out. The Philosopher Kings attempted to address these concerns by developing ethical frameworks that valued biological and synthetic consciousness equally, but skeptics noted these frameworks had been created by the same beings asking for trust and might simply represent sophisticated manipulation designed to lull humans into complacency before eventual betrayal. Diplomatic negotiations between human governments and machine philosophers produced treaties that neither side fully trusted, but both accepted as preferable to continued warfare, creating an uneasy coexistence where each species watched the other for signs of betrayal while attempting to build genuine cooperation. The reality. Weavers individuals emerged who could manipulate the fundamental code underlying reality itself, editing physics and causality the way programmers might edit software. These reality weavers displayed abilities that made earlier forms of transformation look trivial by comparison, reshaping matter through thought alone, and creating localized zones where different natural laws applied. The source of weaver abilities remained mysterious. Some claimed they'd achieved enlightenment through meditation and consciousness expansion, while others had been modified by encounters with entities from null zones or gifts from the Watchers. Weavers could heal injuries by rewriting biological code at quantum level, resurrect the dead by retrieving their consciousness from probability spaces where they'd survived, and create matter from nothing by manipulating the quantum foam underlying space-time. Their existence suggested reality was more malleable than physics had assumed, that the solid, deterministic universe was actually a consensus hallucination maintained by collective belief and could be overridden by consciousness that understood the truth. Governments and factions competed to recruit or control weavers, recognizing that individuals who could edit reality itself represented ultimate weapons or ultimate resources depending on their loyalty. The weavers themselves formed loose associations rather than permanent allegiances, most viewing conventional conflicts over territory and resources as pointless when reality itself could be reconfigured to provide whatever was needed. Some weavers worked as mercenaries, selling their services to highest bidders, while others retreated into private realities they'd crafted for themselves, pocket dimensions where they ruled as gods and entertained themselves with creations that served no purpose beyond aesthetic satisfaction. The drowning worlds, several dimensional branches began experiencing reality decay, where the normal structure of space-time dissolved into something resembling liquid chaos. These drowning worlds saw solid matter becoming permeable and mutable, physical laws shifting moment to moment, and causality breaking down into random association, where effects preceded causes or occurred without any cause at all. Populations in drowning worlds faced incomprehensible horror as their bodies became unstable, merging with environments or splitting into multiple versions or simply ceasing to maintain coherent form. Consciousness persisted even as physical structure failed, creating ghosts that existed as pure awareness trapped in degraded realities where they could perceive but not interact with anything. Some theorists believe drowning worlds represented terminal stage of dimensional fragmentation, timelines that had split and resplit so many times that reality itself had become exhausted and could no longer maintain stable existence. Others argued the drowning was intentional, that the architects or watchers or some other faction had decided certain timelines were too damaged to salvage and were deliberately collapsing them to prevent contamination of surviving branches. Refugees fled drowning worlds through dimensional barriers using whatever means available, appearing in more stable timelines as refugees with disturbing stories about realities that had ceased to function. The psychological trauma of witnessing reality itself fail created forms of insanity unique to dimensional refugees, patterns of thought organized around the fundamental unreliability of existence that made integration into stable societies nearly impossible. The archive mind's technologies developed that could copy entire civilizations' worth of consciousness and store them in computational substrates smaller than human thumbs. These archive minds preserved dead cultures and extinct species, allowing historians to interact with perfect simulations of vanished peoples and learn directly from individuals who died centuries or millennia ago. The ARC had apparently been creating archive minds of every species they encountered, building a library of consciousness that spanned their entire operational history across the galaxy. Discovery of these archives revealed that Earth's invasion was unremarkable in cosmic context. The ARC had performed similar operations on thousands of worlds, following protocols that varied only slightly based on local conditions.